Let's talk about two adjustments that starting pitchers have made in the last month, which could have playoff implications. Joe Musgrove made 10 starts to begin the season before going down in late May for over 2 months with a bone spur in his elbow. Upon returning in August, his fastball shape was different. This is something we can visually see on his pitch plot. If you're unfamiliar with pitch plots, I encourage you to check out a video I made on them. I'll link to it in the card at the top right of your screen right now. Essentially, what we're looking at is the movement of a pitch, both side to side, so arm side and glove side, as well as up and down. Here is Joe Musgrove's early season four-seam fastball. Compare it to his fastball over his last 7 starts. There's a subtle change in the pitch. It moves down and to the left. The simple way to think about it is just that he's cutting the pitch more than he did at the beginning of the season. The nerd angle is that the pitch picked up over 2 miles per hour. It lost about 2.5 inches of vertical break. Lower vertical break means the ball is resisting the downward force of gravity less, so it's dropping more. And it also has 2 inches less arm side movement. Fangraphs Stuff Plus is actually down on this version of his pitch slightly, but the swinging strike rate kicked up from 11% to 14%, which is just above average, and the contact quality improved slightly. I think this added cut on his four-seam fastball could be a byproduct of a slightly lower release height on the pitch. Since coming back from the bone spur in his elbow, his extension down the mound is lower by about an inch, and his release height is down around the same amount. Now, this is where we run into caution territory. I usually hesitate to assume things change mechanically with a pitcher, especially when our margins in terms of the changes are this small. It's not my strength as an analyst to focus on mechanics, so I lean more on release data like this and usually apply some kind of confidence interval to what I'm saying. For this situation, I will play Switzerland and say that I'm only about 50% confident that as a result of the injury, his arm angle flattened out, and that's driving the change in shape of his fastball. Lower slot, generally less ride, and more cut, that kind of lines up. The other 50% could be a variety of things. The one I'll focus on, though, is related to his cutter. Just like we did with his fastball, watch how this pitch also shifts down into the left on our pitch plot when we look before and after this injury. The velocity on this pitch is basically the same, but it has 5 inches less vertical break than it did pre-injury, indicating again that it's dropping more. Just like his fastball, it appears that he's cutting this pitch a bit more and it picked up drop. Or is he? The great Eno Saris inquired with the man himself about this, and Musgrove indicated that he has both a cutter and a gyro slider.
So cutter is like the four seam.
Cutter's been really big for you.
Rotate that way slightly.
That's it.
So still throwing on the top part of the horseshoe, and for this one it's like, if you imagine like throwing a dart, how you're kind of staying underneath the dart with your hand and fingers and you're throwing it out. That's kind of the same thought I have with the cutter, is like keeping the hand underneath the ball and getting like a true four seam. Like,
you're on the side of it.
Push. Slider is the same grip, but now it's on the bottom side of that horseshoe. This is kind of similar to how Dylan holds his. For this one, I'm trying to go opposite of the cutter, where the cutter I'm trying to work underneath, going the slider I'm trying to work more over the top and feel like it's
now you're ripping down a little bit.
And that's where I get like more of the rifle spin, whereas the four seam or the cutter being underneath it, it still pushes and kind of runs up beneath instead of
getting
that kind of motion where I'm working over the top of it.
It's a very subtle difference in the orientation and release between this cutter and his gyro slider, as you could see in the Eno's video. This carries over into the fact that I can't really distinguish between those two pitches in this plot, or even when you break things down situationally. We're kind of only seeing one shape. So is Musgrove lying to us? Obviously not. I remember an interaction I had with a coach last year that applies beautifully to this topic. It starts with a pitcher who I thought was changing his breaking ball shape rather frequently, let's say on a month-to-month basis, more than you would normally expect. So I went to the pitcher and asked him whether he was aware of this. He told me that he thought it was intentional. He thought that based on situation and feel on a given day, he was kind of manipulating the pitch, and that's what I was noticing in the data. So I brought these two cases to the pitching coach and asked him what he thought. And he looked at me dead in the eye, kind of off the record, but I think it's irrelevant now. And he said, that guy has no idea what he's doing with his breaking ball. I can't get him to throw a consistent shape in a pen no matter what. And I thought it was a really harsh way to phrase the topic, but what I got out of him as I dug more was that it's really hard for pitchers who have multiple breaking ball shapes to distinguish between them, especially when they have more gyro, or they're more around that center of a pitch plot. Let's say like Musgrove gyro slider, cutter, and if he had maybe more of like a downer death ball type. Distinguishing between those and not blurring hand feel together, especially for younger pitchers, is really hard to do. Now, I'm not saying that Musgrove cannot distinguish between multiple shapes. What I'm theorizing is that it might be hard for him to hit the exact shape he desires each time, particularly with regard to this cutter and gyro slider that he says are differentiated, but when we look at the plot, I can't really find too much difference between them. I do want to point out that despite everything I have said, whatever Musgrove's doing with this cutter shape, which will combine the cutter and the gyro slider together because that's all we can kind of do from a classification standpoint, it is working. This pitch has dominated. He's doubled the usage versus right-handed hitters and chopped off about 120 points of xWOBA from a results standpoint. He's also locating the pitch more down in the zone to righties as opposed to up when he was pre-injury, suggesting to me that once again, he's really only throwing one shape here, and it's more of that gyro slider offering. If you're a team like the Dodgers, Brewers, or Phillies who saw Musgrove early in the year and haven't seen him since, I'd argue that the value of whatever intel you can gather from that previous matchup is now worth less because of these subtle adjustments. And that's at the crux of why these late adjustments, adding pitches, lowering slot, changing some shapes, can have an impact on the playoffs despite happening in the regular season. We're going to stay on sliders for our next adjustment. Aaron Civale started throwing a new slider on August 9th and has been mixing it in ever since. It's 83 miles per hour with negative 1.5 inches of vertical break and 7 inches of sweep. It's a shorter version of his sweeper, and it was brought into his mix as a way to help against right-handed hitters. He was throwing his bigger sweeper 30% of the time to righties, and his FIP was above 6 in the 2 months before the trade deadline. Despite the sweeper being a good pitch per stuff plus, it had an expected slug over 500, about 100 points above the average. So enter this new slider. It has a 22% swinging strike rate, where the average for a slider is 16%, and he's using it in a lot of different counts. I didn't really think too much of this pitch until I looked at why Frankie Montas, another Brewer, has been on a decent run lately as well. Montas had a 534 FIP in June and July before being traded to the Brewers and has posted a 331 FIP in his first 8 starts with the organization. And would you look at that, he added a slider that has nearly the exact same shape as Aaron Civale's. Montas was throwing more of a lift sweeper with the Reds, 85 miles per hour, 8 inches of vertical break, 9 inches of sweep, kind of an odd shape, much more lift than your average sweeper. So the Brewers flipped him back to a slider that's harder at 86 miles per hour with just 1 inch of vertical break, and it maintained the sweep. Similar to our concept with Musgrove, less vertical break here means less resistance to the downward force of gravity, so it is dropping more. This shape is very similar to the slider he threw back in 2022, and to be fair to the Reds, he was throwing this a bit with their organization. He just was throwing that lift sweeper a lot more. Regardless, the swinging strike rate on his new slider, we'll call it, went from 12% in June and July to now 24% with this new slider. Just like Civale, the Brewers gave him a legit swing-miss weapon versus right-handed hitters that has immediately started showing results. Is this a coincidence that they both added the same shape? Probably not. I think for both pitchers, the Brewers saw a need to improve swing-miss versus right-handed hitters, which is particularly important come playoff baseball when leashes are shorter and teams probably don't want to play around with the margins on balls in play. And the shapes they've decided to go with probably highlight more of a trend that we're going to see in the future. Everything is cyclical, right? Sweepers are great, but if you can command an average slider from a shape perspective that plays off the line of your fastball a bit better than your sweeper, why not have both in your mix? From an advanced scouting standpoint, which is just the prep process to face a team in a series or perhaps a playoff series, 5 to 7 games, if you add pitches or tweak things as a pitcher, even in the final month, what it does is it adds doubt, I think, to that report. Now, I've never advanced scouted myself, but I've talked to a lot of people that have done it. I've tried to do it amateurly on this YouTube channel before. It's a very fun thought exercise. It's inherently very probabilistic. We think this will happen to your kind of right-handed hitter in 2-strike situations. We think versus your swing plane as a left-handed hitter that early count 0-0, 0-1, this is what the pitcher will do. But we don't actually know. And then when you get onto the field, what we've communicated to the hitting staff, what the plan is that you guys have come up with will be executed. And then we will have to adjust because we will see what's actually happening in the dynamic between a pitcher and a lineup or a pitcher and an individual hitter. If you're a pitching staff, I think the way to counter that is just to add some doubt, widen the lanes of things that a hitting staff or an advanced staff has to consider. And that's why I think this stuff is so important. The things you have to think about in relation to these 3 pitchers we talked about are pretty clear. Is Musgrove ever going to break back out that distinct cutter shape, or are the majority of his sliders to right is going to be down away with this new gyro shape? Civale has actually backed off his slider in the month of September. Is he not going to throw that come October? Or is August, where he threw the pitch a lot more and it was really good, what we should be looking at when we're prepping our right-handed bats? Montas' slider shape is different, but he's also moved his fastball location to the outer third of the plate. What matters in this situation? If a guy's seen him in the past, how much is that going to matter in informing how we think Montas will approach that hitter now? The game theory of pitch selection will always be fascinating to me. I cover this in my Substack all the time. It's maybe more so based on location in those instances, but it happens over the course of 162, basically on a start-to-start basis for pitchers. I just think because the sample's so large and regular season stuff just doesn't have as much intensity, it kind of gets glossed over. But I think it's the fabric of baseball generally, choosing certain pitches in certain spots and why you're doing that and what the result is. That is something you can always look back on from an execution standpoint. When you get to the playoffs, those individual decisions are heightened. They're way under the microscope because you're doing it in such a small sample where that one small tweak or pitch selection in a big spot with runners in scoring position can matter substantially more in terms of championship probability than it does in the regular season. That's why I find this stuff so fascinating. I'll be covering it throughout the playoffs on my Substack. I encourage you to sub. And otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this video. This was a tougher one to build just because I wanted to talk about playoff stuff, but I didn't want to give a full preview. So I figured I'd go back to a few adjustments that I noticed and hopefully made some sense of them. Hopefully made some sense of what you will eventually see in the playoffs with these pitchers. And maybe you'll notice something. And if you do, as always, drop it in the comments. I'll be there. Thank you for watching.